To welcome you to this Tocqueville series lecture talk given by Peter Levine today. This is a talk that is sponsored by the Tocqueville program, the Ostrom workshop, and the PACE program at Indiana University. My name is Aurelian Creyuțu, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville program. It's my pleasure to welcome Peter Levine here, who is the Associate Dean for Research and Lincoln Filane Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Tufts University in Boston. He was previously the director of the Circle, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Peter graduated from Yale in 1989 with a degree in philosophy. He studied philosophy at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, receiving his doctorate in 1992. He's the author of We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America, published by Oxford in 2013. He wrote 5 earlier scholarly books on philosophy and politics and a novel. He's been engaged in redefining the curriculum of Civic Studies, very interesting initiatives that should be of interest to our students in the education school. Today's talk in particular will focus on Elinor Ostrom and the citizen's basic question, what should we do? So it's a great pleasure to welcome Peter here under the auspices of the workshop, and thank you for coming today. Peter will speak for about 40-45 minutes. At the most, and then we'll have a vibrant conversation, I hope. So please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's moving to me to be talking about this topic in this room. I was only in this room once, I think, in my life, but there's a reason Elinor Ostrom's pictures on here. And in some ways, what I want to talk about is her legacy, put in a certain context. So one way to enter that conversation is to say that in about 2007 or 8, several of us, 6 or 7 of us, wrote this little manifesto, a few thousand words at the most, for what we called Civic Studies. And one of the authors was Lynn Ostrom, along with Jenny Mansbridge and Arkan Fung and Carol Sultan and Roger Smith, Harry Boyd, and me. I think that's the list. And it's online. It's actually also now in Spanish and Polish, thanks to Carol. And I sort of want to talk about that perspective, the perspective that's in the manifesto. Something practical also happened, which is that Carol Sultan and I started running this annual summer institute, which, by the way, you're invited to. It's for faculty, graduate students, and practitioners. We've done it, we'll be in our 10th year coming up this summer at Tufts, and also now for 3 years in Ukraine. And we have a syllabus, and it's a non-graded seminar. It's really a reading group, but we have a syllabus, and it has a certain somewhat eccentric take on the world, which is the Civic Studies take. And as I reflect myself, speaking only for myself, after 10 years, I think there are 3 powerful currents in this syllabus, in this work. And so I'm writing a book now about these 3 currents together. One of them, I'll get to Lynn last. One of them is Jürgen Habermas and the second generation of the Frankfurt School, and generally deliberative democracy. Another is nonviolence as a theory of social change and social movements. So that's, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King. And the third is the Bloomington School, Vincent, but especially Elinor Ostrom. And we indeed start with her in the syllabus. And I feel like, so the thesis here will be that these actually have something in common, that they are complementary. I also think, and I may not get into this much, that they need each other. That there's ways that the 3 theories are incomplete without the combination. So here's another way in, which isn't something that I don't know whether Lynn would agree with this, but this is just another way into the discussion. I take seriously the idea that a citizen of any country at any time and place, and regardless of whether the person has legal citizenship, is someone who asks this question: what should we do? And I really want to take the question seriously, looking at each of the 4 words. So it is the question, what should we do, meaning that the point of it is to guide action. And so it's not what should I think about public policy or justice, but what should we do? The hardest word is probably we, because I mean it concretely. So the question is not what should be done or what should some other entity such as the government do. The question is what should we do? And the hard part there, so the we must be concrete. It must be some we to which we significantly belong. And the hard part there is really scale, because, so if you take the question of climate change, I think other people in this room from SPIA know better, but I think the answer, what should be done, is actually pretty easy. We should tax carbon globally and redistribute the money. But we can't do that. We could remember to switch off the lights when we leave this room. That doesn't help, because the scale is insignificant. So the question, what should we do, when you take the concreteness of the we seriously, but you also take the needs seriously, is a hard question. The question is really, what should we do, because it's intrinsically normative, and citizens must think in a way that is normative, because the question is, what should we do? Not what do we want to do, what are our preferences, what should we do? And of course that's about both the means and the ends that must be justified. In fact, they must be the right ones, but that is hard to come up with. And finally, I know this is a little bit of a stretch, but it is what should we do, because it is an empirical question as well. It's a question of what are the actual options, how much do they cost, what are their chances of success. So empirical analysis is essential to this question. So what's this question the opposite of, or what is it in tension with? One answer, and I'll give two, is it's in tension with a certain kind of political theory which is state-centered, which is basically asking, where the question of justice is basically what kind of government. Now you should ask, well, how prevalent is this state-centered political theory, because it's not universal and there are exceptions. So I want to just quickly say, I think it's very prevalent, and it's prevalent across a broad political spectrum. So it's not only people who like the government who are state-centered. So here are just 4 quotes. The point of them is that they represent 4 pretty potent, influential forms of political theory right now, of normative political theory, and all of them make a very strong claim that the question of justice is the question of what kind of government. So Philip Pettit, representing republicanism assigns to government the task of promoting freedom. So his value is freedom as non-domination, and republicanism assigns that to government. Martha Nussbaum, representing the capabilities approach, which is a different but also influential theory of justice, says, in the end, it is government, meaning the society's basic political structure, that bears the ultimate responsibilities for securing capabilities. Rawls, of course, said justice, that's in the first paragraph, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, which really means the institutions that are described by the constitution of a country. But then here's the one who is different. Milton Friedman. All those other 3 want more government than we have in the United States today, probably. Milton Friedman wants a lot less. And yet for him, the definition of justice is getting the government right. The challenge is that the government could be too big, but if you get it small enough, you have justice. So they're all state-centered. And my complaint is not that I'm anywhere on the spectrum from more government to less government that's different from them. My complaint is that that's not our primary question. Our primary question is, what should we do? The government enters the picture, but it enters the picture as one of the many things we might form plans with respect to. And that, by the way, that'll be very different if we happen to be living in North Korea, Denmark, the United States. The salience of the question, what kind of government should we have, is going to be different. So one thing is it's an opposite of is state-centered political theory. Another thing it's an opposite of is something that I'm just going to boldly call mainstream policy analysis, so people then can say, but that's not what we do, and that'll be perfectly fine, because this is a bit of a straw man. But I think I'm just trying to make a point with it. So here's a diagram of mainstream policy analysis. You got your social sciences. The social sciences are supposed to generate truth about the social world. But on the very first day of the very first class, when you start to study social science, the professor tells you, but truth is really problematic, because the observer has all kinds of biases. We have to counteract those, but we never fully counteract them. And also, by the way, even if we didn't have biases, the world is uncertain. So truth is problematic. And they do tell you that. I mean, they don't neglect to tell you that. So the arrow from social science to truth is tricky. But the truth is the objective. And the truth is separate from opinions, preferences, and values that people might have about what to do. Because, the truth is that spending money on education would change educational outcomes, but you have to decide whether you value those outcomes and whether they're worth the price. And so that's something separate and doesn't come from social science. It comes from somewhere else, perhaps from the public's will or from public opinion or from somewhere else. Then once you have truth and plus values, you can come up with policy recommendations only then. But then policy recommendations don't walk off the shelf and influence anyone. So you also need somebody to take strategic action, but not the social scientists generally. And then you get change. So that's sort of the model. I'm just gonna hint at the problems with the model, not pretending that I'm persuading you or that this is anything like an exhaustive or careful description, but just so that you know where I'm coming from in terms of what objections I have. So one is that the separation between facts and values just doesn't work because, not in that way, because it implies that a value judgment that I might make is simply a matter of preference or opinion on my part. If I say racism is bad, I do not think that's just my opinion or preference. I think that's a claim about the world that needs to be justified in some way. And justifying it is complicated and hard, but this idea that you could have true claims about the world that are empirical and then everything else is just an opinion is a very crude kind of positivism that won't stand up to scrutiny. But also the data we use when we do social science are deeply imbued with norms. You measure unemployment and you're measuring something that we've decided to define in the way we've decided to define it for all kinds of reasons that have to do with our values. We form our norms because of empirical information. So I'm all for equity in schooling. But why do I believe that schools are good at all? Because we have 250 years of experience, 150 years of experience looking at schools and observing that on the whole they tend to educate. So it's our experience that influence our norms. Strategic considerations should influence our norms unless something can be accomplished by somebody. It's not a very interesting thing to say that it's good or right. We only have empirical evidence because of strategic action. So we know what the unemployment rate is because people have campaigned and lobbied and struggled to get a labor department which collects those data. There are a lot of other things we don't collect data about. So this is obviously totally insufficient as an actual guide, but we need to unify strategy, normative argument, and empirical evidence in some way. And of course, what I'm suggesting here, or beginning to hint at, is that that's what the Bloomington School is up to, which I think is a more contentious point. Here's yet another sort of entree to this conversation. Let's assume that you are a group of people at any scale, but your membership in the group is real, so it's actually a we. I will posit that you have at least 3 types of problems you're going to have to deal with that we can talk about relatively generically. I'm sure there are more categories. This is not meant to be exclusive, but they're pervasive and very significant. 3 large categories of problems. One is, in order to decide what we should do, you're going to have to talk to other people about what we should do. Why talk to other people? Why not just think about it yourself? Basically because of human cognitive limitations and moral limitations. My ideas about what are right are not very good unless I can try them out with other people. If I had been born, in Virginia in 1700 and I was white, I would believe in slavery. So, which is an example of how where we start conditions what we believe. But we have the obligation and opportunity to try out our ideas with people differently situated and learn from that. So we have to be involved in some kind of dialogue about what's right. But dialogue is deeply problematic because people, so I won't go over all these, but because people tend to balkanize when they talk into groups, they reinforce, into subgroups, they reinforce what they already believe. So that's the relationship between balkanization and polarization, because we look for arguments that will support and data that will support what we already believe, motivated reasoning, because propaganda works. And propaganda, I really just mean the ability to pay to persuade people through the use of some kind of technical expertise that persuades. So we have a lot of media effects. Never sure how many I put in these. So we have a lot of problems of discourse. We also have solutions to them, right? If we only had problems of discourse, if those were intrinsic and hardwired in a completely fatalistic way, we never would have invented the Metropolitan Daily newspaper as a device for feeding information to people that challenges their motivated reasoning. Separate, connected, not disconnected, but separate, we have problems of collective action. So even if, so the classic Bloomington School case, which you all know at least as well as I do, if everybody agrees that we really would like to have those fish reproduce in that pond, continue to produce new fish for us so we can eat them. So there's really no difference in opinion about that everybody should get fish, that the fish should survive, that the fish should even be equitably distributed. We still have a problem that if we're not structuring it right, somebody will go take the last few fish and eat them. So we have problems of collective action, of free riding, externalities. I'm going to give you quite a set, right? So these are quite heterogeneous, different kinds of problems, but they arise consistently for groups that, even if the group knows what it wants, can't get what it wants because of these kinds of problems. And then a third category. Well, that's a fancy title for this, but what I really mean is we don't have a we at all, because there's a concrete group of people, and there's a different concrete group of people, and that other group doesn't think we're part of the we, right? So cases of exclusion. So so you're not a citizen, we are. We don't think you have a voice in our commons at all. The examples are very numerous, but certainly, I mean, a case would be, Indians in the British Empire at the time that Gandhi starts. So it's not, the problem is not that Indians and British people haven't deliberated. The problem is that British people don't think Indians have a right to deliberate about the empire. So these are some of the sort of more detailed versions of that problem. All right, so I'm going to actually finish quicker, Aurelian, and we'll have plenty of time to talk. But here's so those are the categories of problems. So here's kind of the reason that I want to put the Bloomington School in a larger context. Because I don't think you can answer these problems by yourself or with armchair theorizing. The understanding of them has to be experiential as well as theoretical, and no one person can do it. So there's not going to be a book that answers the problems. There's enormous literatures on these problems. What we should be looking for are robust theory-practice traditions in which there are both lots of cases of success and failure, and also large sort of conceptual schemes for understanding that experience. And so I think we have three interesting theory practice traditions, and they have the feature that they each centrally address a different cluster of the problems I just put up there. So the Bloomington School, particularly interested in problems of collective action. The Frankfurt School, post-war Frankfurt School, especially interested in problems of discourse, and the nonviolent tradition of Gandhi and King, especially interested in questions of exclusion and when there isn't a we. So the core problem for Lynn and her school is we don't get what we want even though we know what we want. I know it's that they're also interested in other problems, but that's a kind of core problem. The core problem for the Frankfurt School, either we don't know what we want or we want the wrong things for systematically understandable reasons because of propaganda or ideology. And for the nonviolent tradition, we aren't a we at all. We are the they to somebody else's we. A classic or typical symptom, there's a reason that Lynn was so influential in environmental and ecological studies. A classic example is we degrade some resource that we believe is valuable. But of course, that doesn't have to be a natural resource. It could be trust in a community or lots of other things that are public goods. For the Frankfurt School, the classic problem is ideology and propaganda that into a authentic discussion of what we should do is inserted somebody's intentional and skillful effort to manipulate. And for the Gandhi King tradition, it's exclusion. You got to learn from experience, and each of these schools has a different. So the term petri dish is used in the. I should have. Possible someone in this room wrote that phrase in relation to Bloomington, but the Bloomington School, but it's used in Bloomington School writing. But I generalize here. You have to have some relatively pure example of the problem from which you can draw conclusions. So the problem, the classic kind of problem for the Bloomington School is a common pool resource, such as the pond. For the Habermasian tradition, it's an intentional deliberative forum where people are trying to reason together. So whether that's a parliament or a town meeting. I find it interesting that Jürgen Habermas is not too interested in actual concrete deliberation, but that's a separate question. And for the Gandhi King tradition, it's an actual nonviolent movement. It's the Montgomery bus boycott. I think we could zero in on one act that's definitive of citizenship for each of these movements. And perhaps act is not quite the right word, but for the Bloomington School, citizenship is fundamentally about collaboration, and it's worth taking the etymology of that seriously. Labor is in the middle of that. It's about working together. In some of the classic cases in the Bloomington School, there isn't that much talk. In the Huertas agricultural example, the irrigation example, they haven't really had a planning meeting since the Middle Ages. So a lot of the work is with your body. It's actual work. For Habermas, it's deliberation, and for Gandhi and King, it's sacrifice. So the way to make the other, to force the other to take us seriously, if you don't have a gun at their head, is a sacrifice. These things relate. They relate in lots and lots of complicated ways, but they can still be parceled out. What all three have in common is the normative focus is not what is justice, but rather something like how do we enhance human agency and responsibility. All of them are very profoundly concerned with arguing against deterministic views that would make their whole projects impossible. So, assuming that Lynn Ostrom is best known in this room, she has to have a huge argument with the kind of tragedy, the Commons presumption, the Garrett Hardin kind of presumption, that it would be impossible to save that pond. And she wants to turn that into a comedy. But, I mean, into a drama. Not an inevitable comedy, but a drama. If I'm going too quickly about Ostrom, because you don't happen to know about her, just ask me. But I would say the same thing about Habermas. He comes from an original tradition, Marxist tradition, in which it's impossible to have discussion in a capitalist society without propaganda. But he says, no, it's actually up to us. It depends on how we design the discussions. It's not a tragedy of ideology. It's a drama of ideology. And of course, one of the main jobs of Gandhi and King is to tell their own followers that that they're not condemned to exclusion. And they all combine facts, values, and strategies. Now, I think myself that Habermas isn't our best guide on facts or strategies, but is our best guide on values. And that Vincent and Lynn Ostrom were a little, I don't think they were weak on values. I think they were a little reticent about values, a little prone to hide them for various reasons, which I'd be interested in people's perspectives on, but I think maybe partly rhetorically. So I do think there are values that are deeply embedded in the first approach, the Bloomington School, and it's appropriate that de Tocqueville is looking at us because they're somewhat de Tocquevillian values. But this is my last slide, and then we have lots of time to talk. This is a quote, of course, some people probably know it by heart, some people may have seen it before. It's a quote by Lynn from Governing the Commons. As long as people are described as prisoners, policy prescriptions will address this metaphor. Of course, she's talking about the prisoner's dilemma. I would rather address the question how to enhance the capabilities of those involved to change the constraining rules of the game to lead to outcomes other than remorseless tragedy. And I would just emphasize two things. First of all, I mean, it's interesting use, it's fairly rare use of the first person singular in her work. This is a mission, right? This is not, I would like to publish articles and find out how things work. This is, I would like to enhance the capabilities of those involved. There's a reform agenda here. And secondly, she wants to enhance the capabilities of those involved. And that's deeply normative. So I think the core idea here is the focus on human agency and responsibility. And her relation to that is that she wants to enhance it. Now, it's still a little thin in a way because, well, and it's only one sentence, two sentences. Still a little thin because she doesn't tell us too clearly what the difference between tragedy and some other outcome is. So you need more normative analysis to decide what a good outcome is. Not to mention that people could change the constraining rules of the game in ways that are more or less just, and we could talk about that. So I think she's needs the complement of the other two traditions. The reason she needs the complement of the nonviolent tradition is also that I think this Bloomington School is a better account of how to make stable institutions solve collective action problems, and less effective as an account of what to do if people are locking you out of the institutions that exist. But let me leave that quote up there as a little extra inspiration, and I would just love to talk and hear what you all think, and not only questions, but also criticisms or different perspectives would be great.
Thank you. So I'd like to take two questions at a time, if you don't mind, so that he can address both and you can engage in the conversation. So Federica and then Mike first. And please raise your hand and say who you are so that Peter can know who you are.
Hi, I'm Federica Cargatti. I'm the Associate Director of the workshop. You started out talking about syllabus, and as you went through your talk, I kept on thinking, this is great, right? But how do we get to the point of implementing this? And the idea of a syllabus sounds very promising to me, right? Teaching a new generation of leaders what the theoretical and empirical basis are. Can you say a little bit more about the syllabus and how you use it and what kind of responses you get?
Okay. Mike?
Yeah, let me pick up on some of the points you just covered, because I like the way you're characterizing Lynn's work in the Bloomington School in general as focusing on collective action and on trying to solve problems, basically, rather than trying to define what problems deserve to be solved, or even the details of how to go about, the strategies to go about that. Because there's two aspects of Bloomington School that I think that really taps into very well. One is Vincent's work, because he was explicitly normative throughout his career.
I agree.
And yet he never was particularly clear. It was all about self-governance, but it was never clear what the self-governance was for, or how those selves were defined, how groups were sort of defined. That was sort of taken as given. And so that gets directly at the problems you're talking about, inclusion and exclusion. So that was an area that didn't really integrate. And we've been trying to figure out how to understand polycentric governance in a more empirical sort of manner. And I'm a bit of a gadfly now, because I keep trying to make the concept capture everything Vincent meant by that term. And I don't think that's possible, because he just meant so many different things by that. The other side is a strategy. Another thing that's bothered me a little about the Bloomington School is how rarely we actually talk about the actors that really have direct influence over policy outcomes. You know, how you move away from these ponds, governance of very small sort of settings, and really engage with the political actors that really have influence, and really engage with most of the policy literature that you talked about, mainstream policy. That's not really, it's kind of off to the side, because we're not looking at things that would involve mobilization of large political coalitions to influence political outcomes and things like that. So I think you're really onto something there about if you complement the emphases of the Bloomington School with a more explicit focus on values and where those values come from or should come from, and then with political strategy, it makes it a much richer sort of tradition. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now I should answer, right? Because otherwise my
Absolutely.
The buffer is now full.
Take as much time.
So the syllabus. One thing is the syllabus is online. It's easy to find, or I'll send it to you if you have trouble finding it. It's so Carol Sultan and I make it up so you could do it a different way. In fact, I'm excited to have. One goal would be that there are other summer institutes of civic studies which take it from a different direction. But it does feel to me as if it fits into those three buckets that I've described. But there are a lot of other authors. So we put a Robert Putnam and Discussion of Social Capital under the Bloomington School. So Lynn comes first, but he fills in, and then the piece of I sort of allude to this because I struggle with it a little. There's Habermas, and then there's deliberative democracy as a set of practices. Habermas is pretty uninterested in deliberative democracy as a set of practices. Most of the practitioners are very interested in Habermas. So we have these readings by Jenny Mansbridge, but also more practical readings about deliberation, and there's some tension between the theorists and the practice. But But I think you could build a syllabus where you had a different set of authors, quite different. One question is, would it be different if you did it? Well, so we have one other experience, which is Ukraine, where we've done it for 3 years. And there we have a lot more attention to the question of dealing with immediate past evil. Though you could argue that we need that in the U.S. But, I mean, seriously, race, basically. But we have a lot more about sort of memory and formation of nations through memory. But, and we have less American constitutional stuff, because in this context, we do Madison as a civic theorist as well, but he sort of drops out in Eastern Europe. So I'm happy to talk more. I don't know if I answered what you were thinking of. So two issues to Mike's question. One is, so I think a lot of the remember the tips or what do you call them? The best practices kind of design principles. So they're all normatively complicated. They can trade off against each other, and they can be good or bad. So an example I like to use is the rebuilding of Jerusalem in the Bible that's told in the book of Nehemiah. It's a wonderful story because it's quite detailed about how that Jerusalem is a common pool resource. It's only once the wall is complete around that it will function, that people will move into the city. People individually contribute to the festival that makes the city beautiful. It's very clear. But all the way through, there's also the whole thing depends on a demarcation of the Israelites from everyone else. They literally have to guard the place 24/7 with spears because they're going to be assaulted by the people on the outside and then when they're finished, the main thing they do is mock the people who weren't included. So, clear boundaries and several other design principles come into play, but this is also a case where some have been left in and some have been left out. Now, not necessarily illegitimately. Maybe it's the right thing, but there has to be some discussion of which. A pure Habermasian says everybody should be in the discussion and they should discuss the basic principles. What I learned from the Bloomington School is you can't have a discussion that's of any value unless you have an institutional context that creates an entity that can make decisions and discuss. Right? Even the discussion forum is everybody is contributing their time by showing up. So you have to overcome collective action problems to have any kind of discussion at all. So I don't buy the Habermasian answer, which is everybody, the Moabites and the Israelites should discuss. I don't think you can do that unless you create some framework in which they could. What was my comment about your last question? Your question was about how you relate to state institutions.
Yeah, that was a lot.
So I think all of these frameworks, the problem is the problem of scale, because it's not hard to define a civic space as one in which people deliberate, collaborate, and form relationships that are inclusive. It's much harder to see how that has anything to do with what the IMF does. And so so all three of those theories have to struggle with scale because the extra word I'll just throw in is leverage. So when we try to affect big things, we can't do it directly. We use leverage, but leverage is not collaborative and it's not deliberative and it doesn't involve relationships. It's detached. So if you're using leverage, the person you're leveraging doesn't deliberate with you. So I think all three theories have to deal with the inevitability of leverage in some new way.
Dan?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of overlaps in terms of what these three different units of the problem, or how we might cross these boundaries. And so, for example, if I think of, one of Lynn's projects as sort of a microcosm of collective action problems was the stuff on interdisciplinary, right? Getting all of us around the table and understanding each other, which is a discursive concern in the first place, before you can make progress as a collaborative group, right, in asking questions. So Habermas comes in there, and Mike was around. I wasn't around when Vincent, lorded over 3-4 hour discussions of what a single word meant.
Oh, at least.
Yeah.
Common sometimes.
Yeah, but this kind of groundwork was, maybe not to that extent, but to some extent necessary, right, before you could get to where he and Lynn wanted to go with the project, right? So you had that, and then you had, her word capabilities here goes back to Nussbaum, which goes back to Sen. And if you bring in Sen's more recent work on justice as problem solving, essentially, then you come back again to the Bloomington School kind of approach. So I think there are ways of sort of attacking this syllabus that they're not so much necessarily supplemental to each other, but complementary in the way they bring out different facets of what the others are doing. With respect to exclusion and boundary rules and so forth, I have a paper with a couple of co-authors, including Lynn, coming out.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Finally,
Great.
on grandfathering in environmental policy. And of course, the first thing that resource users do when they establish, and this is almost universally true, it's not quite in Lynn's case studies, the first thing they do to establish a common property regime to conserve a common pool resource over time is to exclude others. Right? So we have to, in a way, at some level, and it sort of depends on the scale and scope of the resource. Later she's writing about climate change, and you can't do that at a global level. But so exclusion appears there as well, and so it actually becomes part of a solution to the problem, a problem that Lynn deals with, whereas for Habermas it represents a problem to be overcome.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Let me add one question to Dan's commentary. I was for a long time under the impression that the political agenda of the Bloomington School was non-political, in the sense that politics was missing from, this is one way of looking at it, politics was missing from their agenda, which is not the case with the third one,
right,
with Gandhi and King. It could be the case with Frankfurt School, because the level of abstractness might lead one to say that it's not real it's not political theory, it's abstract political theory.
Yeah.
But I want to press on this, whether there's a political theory behind the agenda of the Bloomington School. You asked what would be the normative values here. If you look at the people that they drew upon, starting with Tocqueville there, Vincent was very taken with Hobbes. We all make mistakes at some point, so we can be excused with Hobbes.
But
Which was his conclusion about Hobbes, by the way.
Yeah, but there is something to be said about his preference for Hobbes. It's a normative aspect leading to order and rules of governance. And then he was very taken with the Federalist Papers, but again, not with Madison, more so with Hamilton. That's a surprising element, because it may stand in tension with his preference for self-government, because Hamilton was the big government, the energetic government person. And he should have, I always thought he should have liked the anti-Federalist more than the Federalist Papers, but
He never did.
But he never did. So I was trying to figure out if today anyone from the political world would like to look at the Bloomington School, for example, what would be that political constituency for that? What do you think?
Yeah.
I have my own suspicions.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just do it in the reverse order, though I do remember, at this moment I remember what you said. If I don't remember it in a minute, help me.
Sure, I remember.
So I guess, there's a not a bad conversation to sort of place, to decide what the large-scale policy implications of the Bloomington School are, and then try to figure out who would like them and who would struggle with them. So certainly some kinds of decentralization and polycentrism, meaning actually taking apart the big police force and dividing it up into different police forces. Or, she certainly advocated for schools, for Tocquevillian schools of citizenship, meaning that you would want to build up opportunities for participation. So you'd want, you might want charter schools because each charter school is a separate governing board as opposed to big public school systems. So I think that's a worthy thing to think through. I guess I don't feel like it's the heart, and so then you'd end up with allies. You might end up with some libertarian and classical liberal allies because this is she sees potential in self-governance and decentralization. You might also end up with some lefties because it's environmentalist and because there's a tradition of localism and so on the left. Somehow I don't feel like that's the heart of this. I think because I think that those questions sometimes evade our direct responsibility. So the question we go back to what should be done rather than what should we do. So what should be done is the government should decentralize power so that more people have a chance to govern. I just want to push on that. What could we actually do to make that happen? And would that path be our best path? Would that policy path be our best path? It's just a different focus, because I don't mind having a conversation about what the policy implications of their findings are. Another case would be, of course, in development economics, where it tends to be an argument for more local solutions and less World Bank build a big dam. So I'm for that. I'm just not sure that's the heart of it. I feel like I left some of what you said on the table, but before I forget, so one thing is I think you could treat Sen as a civic theorist. Part of this is these theorists are stimuli to thinking through the actual problem, and he's a good stimulus. Some reason I don't find it as satisfying, but that's probably somewhat subjective. The place I would push on him a little bit is I do think he imagines that there's some kind of a global conversation about justice, which he would like to be popular and inclusive, but which is ultimately going to be in places like the UN General Assembly, that he's going to influence with normative arguments. And anyway, maybe we shouldn't talk too much about Sen, because Sen's great, and there's no point in my arguing against him. But the other question is the interdisciplinarity of this, and even the academic politics and sociology of it. So these questions are inside baseball. You may not be interested, but I am interested in: do we need something new that would be called civic studies? Should political science be civic studies? There have been voices in the history of the American Political Science Association who've said that it was, but it would be a different political science. If it's something new, could it be an intellectual movement, or does it have to be a discipline? So I hesitate with this analogy because it could come across as extremely arrogant, but I just mean it as a thought experiment. You could say that second wave feminism and the women's movement have face the challenge. Women are systematically missing from curriculum and from thinking. There's also a political movement trying to change that. The choice for academics and intellectuals is inside the university or outside, in a separate women's studies department or in all departments, and these so it's pretentious to make an analogy to that because that's much more important and much bigger. But the same challenges arise, I think, for civic studies. The problem is that civic action as such is missing or marginal. There are civic movements out there in the world that are doing civic things. Do you want a new discipline? Do you want a new department? Would you rather turn a department like political science into your department? And those are questions that I find interesting. I think that Lynn was really, really good at those kinds of questions as well.
Jack, can I just add that, so with respect to the major question of what should we do, Lynn was asked that question often when she traveled somewhere where they were having a problem. And her answer was always, well, I don't know what you should do about your problem, but there's a prior problem that was very preoccupying for her, which you really haven't touched on, which is how do we understand your problem, which we need to do before we can decide what to do about the problem.
Or how do you understand?
Or how do you understand your problem, right? And how can you help the rest of us understand your problem?
Yeah, right. So there's a cumulative research agenda here. That's something I never said, but that's important because I think that this is different from the kind of theories that say, well, the resistance to theory. So Ben Flugberg is an interesting guy to read, but his view is you can't really generalize at all, and experts really don't have much to teach that comes from another place. Experts can be part of a local problem-solving practice, but all they're doing is crunching numbers or something like that in service of the or asking questions. I think the Bloomington School is much more ambitious than that, and is trying to figure out regularities at the right level. So not too much regularity because conditions vary and because people need to own the solution, but any regularities we can find, we should really share, not keep them to ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have the announcement in front of me, but I seem to recall the title given was "What Should a Citizen Do?"
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And we've heard a lot about we's, but we haven't heard anything much about what a citizen is. And this may be related to the discussion we're just having about grandfathering. What is a citizen in this? I mean, there's some vague, generalized person there who wants something done that affects him or her collectively. But is that a citizen? Or is a citizen a person who is defined by certain legal rules, etc., maybe by place of residence, birth, in any other way? And then the corollary is you've been talking about what should a citizen do in a problem-solving sense, but what should a citizen be doing in a citizen sense? In other words, what makes for a better citizen? Take the obvious example. To be a good citizen, should one have to be expected to vote in elections? Should be one expected to deliberate in a deliberative discussion? And is there an expectation of a certain quality of judgment in those? So could you comment more about this, what I think is this interesting issue, and it's certainly of contemporary relevance. Oh, and then one other thing, what is a citizen in a federalized society where you have, in a sense, multiple levels of citizenship?
Right.
So can you comment a little more on that?
Yep. So I have an answer, Les. I think it's controversial. I mean, I think there's obviously a rebuttal, but my answer is the normative core of citizenship is that you can ask, and you do ask, what should we do in some kind of group? I'm very polycentric, so I think those groups are multiple for everyone. So it's my neighborhood association, it's my country, it's the world, it's global, it's the American Political Science Association. It's all these things. I'm a citizen in each of them. There has to be an actual we, so which means that it has to have some ability to make change. So I have to be actually a member of it. So I can be excluded. So I'm a member of the APSA, but I'm not a member of the American Sociological Association, so I'm not a citizen of that. And then the question is, so then we learn from the Bloomington School that groups need boundaries and criteria of inclusion. So that includes the United States. So the United States as a group may have criteria of exclusion and inclusion. So I don't have in principle, normative objection to saying that there's also this thing called U.S. citizenship, which is the official participation in this community. I do think that it raises further questions about that we should then pursue about whether the boundaries are too porous or too tight, whether they're too large or too small. But I'm not in principle against having the boundary. So legal citizenship fits in the framework in the sense that everybody's a citizen. Everybody's a citizen of everything, of lots of things, not of everything. Everybody's a citizen of lots of things. The U.S. government is one of those things, and then we should reason together about where the boundaries will work for that. The responsibility is basically a responsibility to participate in seriously asking that forward question. But in order to do that, you have to get into the next stage of analysis, which is what rules and use are we going to need in this group? What dialogue do we need to have? Who is and who isn't excluded? And you really have to think those things through. Should you vote? Yes, but I mean, there's a long train of thinking between this argument and why you should vote, and what you have to go through in between is an analysis of the governmental structure you're facing as to whether the vote is a useful tool. So it isn't in North Korea, although you probably should vote because they'll kill you if you don't. But you know, it probably is in the U.S. Although honestly, if you've got a tremendously gerrymandered districts and so on, I'm not completely sure I want to go to bat for you should vote. So it's a subsidiary question, not a primary question.
We have two questions.
I wanted to throw in on this, on Nessa's question, thinking about the development of the civic engagement movement as it currently stands now, which has developed service learning for us. And so the elements of service learning, there are strong elements of service learning that emphasize the civic. And thinking about your statements earlier of whether we should develop a discipline or political science should be the central hub of civic development, service learning suggests that it should be throughout, that it should be taught through that experiential process where students learn through the experience, civic values, skills, collective action, encouragement to collective action. It's problematized in practice now by the experience. The experiential education dominates in favor of the discipline, and we don't emphasize the civic elements. So I guess my question is, this is my practice in the service learning program here.
Great.
And this is a question. How do we ask this question all the time? What do we do? How do we bring this out to all disciplines and encourage an overlay of the civic examination of the engagement with community partners, whoever they may be? And I'll just suggest that or point out that we emphasize, at least here, and I think in other schools, asking the question of what is the problem. That it's incumbent on the student, it's incumbent on the professor to first ask what is the problem from the community perspective rather than the imposition. So assuming agency at the community level to define the problem or at least be able to engage in problem identification so that there can be a conversation where some assistance may result. Typically it's heavier on the learning side than on the community assistance side. So I guess the question is, at the larger scale of the responsibility of higher education,
Yes.
where does this lie in the development of citizens and rejuvenating society by creating, rejuvenating democracy by creating democratic participation and so on?
Yeah.
Take this question.
So I mean, I love service learning. I sort of came up in that right from my undergraduate days. I think that so two things. One is, of course, if this framework works, then the practices you want to include in service learning are practices of deliberation, which is very commonly done, social movement derived strategies. But the other one is institutional analysis from the Bloomington School. So figuring out what makes groups. So thinking explicitly about things like collective action problems. Lynn wrote about civic education when she was APSA president, and her argument, if I remember right, was traditionally, as a certain Frenchman noted, we learn these skills. Some skills of self-governance are counterintuitive. We traditionally learn them from experience. We learn how to deal with free riders and people like that through experience. That has eroded in the United States in general. So service learning can be seen as a response to that because we will get some kids doing it. But at the same time, our understanding of those issues might be improving due to research conducted in buildings like this. And you don't have to learn everything experientially. In fact, I kind of dissent from the extreme, and you do too, I think, for the way you spoke, but the extreme experiential view of civic learning, which is kids should just be asked to figure out problems. Kids, meaning college students or teenagers, should be given the power and choice to come up with their own issues and their own solutions. I mean, we should learn cumulatively. We don't have to be so pretentious as to think that we have a kind of engineering science of civic life, but we have some learning. So if we can, if they don't have to figure out that there are free riders in a group and how to overcome it, but we can actually tell them groups have free riders, why not? So this is actually a case for more theory. In a funny way, in this, there's a big pendulum swing between, everything's theory and everything's practice. Service learning helpfully moves us towards more theory, more practice. But in that inside baseball there, I would like to actually say more theory. So can we actually theorize not about service learning, which is usefully written about, but about society? So can the students who are working in service learning theorize? And they probably do in your program, but they don't always. So there's a certain spirit of let the kids' views are authentic and let them develop their own views, but they are going to fail. They are going to fail because small groups of people given finite amounts of time to solve big problems do not succeed. So could we bring in some resources from theory that would help them to be a little more effective?
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, let me make one quick comment and then the question was going to. I remember one of Lynn's works, I think it was when she did her APSA presidential address. She basically recommended political science should be defined as the study of collective action. So I think you really identified the collective action part in there. The later civic studies was important to her too, but it was a little sort of different. Collective action was really at the heart of what she was doing.
Yes,
I was struck by your comment earlier that there's a problem with scale in all three of these perspectives you're trying to integrate. And I can't stop thinking that maybe that means there's a factor missing, that somehow your list is incomplete.
Yeah, I think
that
it is.
there's something that sort of links. And give me an example. I was trying to understand what you said civic behavior kind of works better at sort of a small scale, individual scale.
Yeah.
Well, I could imagine civic behavior working well, say, at an elite political scale, where you have political elites who are excluding participation from others. They're deliberating with each other. They're using the existing institutions and creative ways to come up with practical solutions to the problem. And that could kind of be seen as a decent representation of civic behavior at that level. And many of us in this country are somewhat nostalgic for the day when that's the way politics was done at the national level. It was behind closed doors. I mean, anyway, don't get away from that. So what I wonder is if what might be missing is somehow linking between behavior at different levels. And I was struck that your nonviolent component really deals with the strategic use of existing institutions. But I don't think any of the three perspectives you're addressing really talk about building institutions and putting them together. And someone mentioned the Federalist Papers, association with Vincent, and they got me thinking along those lines. That really was one of the things Vincent would really emphasize then. This was an example of how to build institutions. Not perfect, certainly not perfect, but it was a solution to a problem. But it was, when he wrote his book on the political theory of the American Compound Republic, it really was meant to be this: how do you do institutions? How do you build institutions? Political sort of theory. And I don't know who would be a better example of that than the Federalist Papers from this tradition. But is there something, and that would get into this question of citizenship too? What should be the connection between individual and how should they see people representing them? How should the representatives see the individuals? What should be the connections between intermediate organizations at different kinds of levels? Right. So does that sound like something that needs to be put in somehow?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, descriptively, I think that's what happens. You have levels. You have the civic behaviors at different levels. Yeah. And the problem though is if you're not in one of those levels, what are you supposed to do? And I think we built up institutions that help to bridge the big bridging institutions, and they're pretty weak. One example would be political parties, which used to be institutions that are now basically brand names for independent candidates. So that would be a reform. That would be a policy reform agenda, building up those institutions. Then the next question is, how do we actually participate in that policy reform agenda, like you and me? So those were 2 points. There was another point though that I wanted to bring out because everything you said was interesting. Can you help me? What did I leave?
The building institutions rather than manipulating.
So there's a very strong kind of fatalism or determinism in the social capital literature. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Robert Putnam, he's basically saying, if you had singing societies in Italy in the 15th century, then you have social capital. Otherwise, you're doomed. That could be true, but I like to think of it in a different way. I mean, if you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, the most important thing they have to do is they have to get everybody to work without the buses. And they have the cars, because a bunch of black people had cars. They don't have a system. So they have to structure it. Now, if you're out, and they do it, they get 25,000 people to work every day for 6 months. Right. If you analyze how they did that, they do have the asset of the black church. Plural, I mean, all the black churches. But they have to completely reconfigure that asset to make it into a bus, the replacement of a bus.
Right.
So if you emphasize the fact that, well, they had the black church, you're fatalistic because then you either have it or you don't, and we have it less now. But I would emphasize the creativity. It wasn't obvious that the black church was that the church was a device for getting people to work, right? So it's I would emphasize
reports in other ways.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. It turns out I didn't know this, but it turns out there was pretty big literature in the 50s. Gunnar Myrdal contributed to, which said that the reason for the slow pace of progress on racial justice in America was the black church because it sucked up all the talents into religion, and then it turned into the most liberating force in American post-war life. So how did that happen? So I think I want to emphasize the fact that the civic level assets that we have are somewhat flexible, and they're what we make of them rather than lying there on the shelf ready to be plugged in.
Well, and Gene Sharp carries this out in his analysis of nonviolent strategies by saying, and one possibility is to create parallel and independent structures to an existing structure within a system that you're trying to leverage or change. And then the question, becomes: do those become the institutions, or is it simply a means to re-enter the current institutions that already exist? So he carried that out, looking at Gandhian nonviolence and also King's work.
No, I agree. He's really strong on the strategic. Very little about the normative, but that's a separate question.
Sandra?
My question is sort of, I guess, a worry that perhaps your model of civic studies will put philosophers out of business, but I'm wondering that, I'm kind of wondering, you set things up as a sort of, your model is an alternative to state-centered approaches to justice, but I'm wondering if those state-centered approaches to justice, and especially the articulation of a kind of vision of a just society and the basic structure of a just society, thinking, I guess, about Rawlsians, kind of needs to come back into your model with respect to the word should, because that should, it seems, is pretty thin unless you have some normative theories of justice to inform it, or is that am I putting
it's a really good discussion topic for discussion. It has to do with the degree to which the end, in the sense of a whole just society, is important to the people making action. And I think that it's very reasonable to say that it is, that it's the North Star. I also have my doubts that it's really, that we need a North Star. Partly it's the sort of metaphor about rebuilding a ship while you're sailing. That is to say, the first goal may be to keep us together as a community that can then go on and reason about where it's going, rather than the first goal being to go towards the North Star. But that's one sort of topic. Obviously, there's two sides to that. We could talk about that for a long time. But the other thing is, I don't want to put philosophers out of business. I actually, in all seriousness, have a plea to philosophers, which is to pay attention to the normative aspects of a different set of questions. So, actually, I have no problem with. In fact, I think everybody should study the sort of theories of justice, which are state-centered, as part of the curriculum. But what about all the questions that arise for actors at a kind of middle level? So a lot. This is a stereotype and overgeneralization, but a lot of philosophy is either about individual ethics, should I lie or whatever, or what's the just society. What about the ethics of, for example, membership? So when you're in a group, you're prone to possibly complicity, but on the other hand, you are enabled to have kind of deliberative values that are impossible if you're not in a group. So when in a group, are you obligated to walk out? And when are you obligated to stay and be part of the conversation and even tailor your own views to what the group is? When should you be humble in face of disagreement? When should you walk out? So that seems to me a whole bunch of philosophical questions that are underexplored because of Rawls. No, because of a focus on. No, well, he's great at everything. I totally admire him, but he does say justice is the first virtue of social institutions, and then he says, when he talks about imperfect justice, that what you have to do is figure out the social institutions, and then that just tells you what to do. And that completely hides a whole set of very complicated, very interesting philosophical questions that haven't been much talked about for a long time. So I actually want the philosophers to be inspired by this, not marginalized or put out of work.
Federica is not a philosopher.
Federica
but,
was a
close.
philosopher for a while.
Yeah.
So this is interesting to me because I was actually interested in your answer to that same question. How do we bring the state back in at some point?
Yeah.
And your answer suggests that the middle ground and the state ground and perhaps the individual ground are like logically separate, which I think is a move the philosophers make.
Yeah, no,
but then
it's a
I'm
mistake.
thoroughly
Yeah.
unsatisfied by it because
Yeah.
the state not only exists in the same temporal and spatial dimension in which the individual or the organization, but the state determines in fundamental ways the structures within which coordination, cooperation, discourse can take place. So to me, like separating the two spheres, like by premising or by assuming a logical priority, seems to me problematic simply because the state de facto is already shaping the way that we interact, even us here. So.
Well, I would push it even further, though. We're also influencing. We're also the state. I did lay out or kind of suggest that there was a sharp distinction between state and society. But one of the things I learned from the Bloomington School is polycentrism, and there isn't. So states themselves are assemblages of lots of actors, and are in fact made up of people. Well, to start with, are made up with people who are also not just actors in the state. That's why you have principal agent dilemmas and other things. But actually, when I say the states are made up of people, that's too simple because they're also made up of buildings and guns and all those things are in complicated relation to other people. The guns are sold to them by companies, and so one kind of answer is to say we don't want a state-centered view of what's just, because the state itself dissolves under close. I mean, analytically, it dissolves under close investigation. It's not fundamentally different from other forms of social organization. It's just in certain constitutional systems, it has certain powerful functions, and we should take those seriously. But it's not fundamentally different from other things, and that's helpful too if you're a citizen positioned. First of all, if you work for the government, including if you're, say, President of the United States, you should actually have a civic framework and be asking, what should I do? But if you're not in the government, or maybe you don't even have documentation to be a citizen of the United States, but you're present here, the government is one of the things you can influence, but so are other things, and they're all enmeshed. So I think I would go that direction rather than...
Very much a Vincent direction.
Yeah.
Just because there are lots of people some people from the education school, I want to add one comment and a question to this. So there were a few persona non grata in the workshop, I remember, but one name that was always triggering the ire of Lynn and Vincent was Max Weber.
Okay.
And, Max Weber was never a how should I put it, a darling of the Ostroms in the school. And I always enjoy reading Max Weber, and I understand why some people like it. And if we were to devise this curriculum for civic studies, would you have such names that should be studied? And how should we study people who have a state-centered approach?
Yeah.
Or should we just ignore them?
Yeah. So I'd want to go reread the book Politics as a Vocation, that essay, and see if we could, which I haven't read for 20 years, and see if we could get something out of that about how should we be. The other, not remembering it very well, I don't want to answer your question except to say he could be a very powerful diagnostician without being the direct supplier of solutions. So I take Weber to be extremely influential in Habermas, and Habermas believes, for one thing, that specialization and means-ends rationality are definitive of modernity, and that's one of the things we struggle against, to have a deliberative democracy. But, of course, I want to teach Habermas, not Weber. I mean, if I had enough time, I'd do Weber and Habermas, but I want to pick Habermas because Habermas has some solutions to it. What I remember of Weber writ large is mostly the diagnosis, not the cure. Or I don't necessarily are not satisfied with the cure. But there probably is. Anyway, it certainly should be persona non grata.
Okay.
Picking up on that, bringing up Weber to me also then brings up Herbert Simon, who was very influential with the Ostroms, right? As opposed to Weber. but who was at least in one of his careers writing on similar subjects to Weber. And then with respect to your earlier comment about knowing when to participate, when to leave, or when to speak up, when to leave, that's Hirschman, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and so he...
Yeah. Oh, Hirschman's critical.
Right, yeah. And although the Ostroms never talked or wrote much about Hirschman. Right? And so...
And Hirschman only, turning to Sandra, I mean, Hirschman doesn't give you an ethic of that. He tells you that...
he's a pragmatist about that.
I guess, or something. I mean, it's a very great little book, but I mean, he's telling you that when you're in a group, you have the choice of exit, voice, and loyalty is another term. He's not telling you when you should use exit and when you should use voice. Right?
Well, I think we know when we should exit, because I think we're almost close to our end of the conversation here.
Yeah.
Are there any other final comments, questions that you might want to ask? I don't want to abuse their patience. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Peter, for a very...
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.